Jayanti. I will share my screen and I hope everyone is able to see it.
Yes, it is visible.
Perfect. Thank you. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about a little bit more about how do we look at India's heavy-duty vehicles, especially from the perspective of decarbonizing them. And initially, I will share some slides and put my point of view across with everyone, and then post that, I think we can have some discussions based on what I present, but also if there is something that may not be kind of in the slides, and if people want to discuss, we can do that as well. So why is this important? So the reason why we are really interested in cleaning the transport sector in general is because if developing economies are not able to reduce their emission in next 24, 25 years, whatever gains that we will get from some reduction that might happen in the developed world, be it US and Europe, it will not be enough for us to kind of achieve the Paris commitment. So be it China, be it India, be it Africa, be it the other Asia Pacific regions, I think it is really important for these economies and geographies to clean the emission, but most importantly, emission from the transport sector. Now, what is happening is that if we don't do, then the numbers are going to rise manifold in 30 years or so. So if you look at India's emission from a base of 2020 and what is projected in a business as usual scenario, it's more than tripling in a space of 30 odd years. So cleaning transport is vital for the overall decarbonization, and we'll come to a little bit later on why we are looking at cleaning the heavy-duty vehicle segment, especially in India. Now, globally, if we look at, transport accounts for roughly a quarter of greenhouse gas emission. And within that, the road transport is roughly 3/4 of that emission. And within road transport, the heavy duty and light duty is roughly almost of equal proportion, even though the light duty is slightly more than the heavy duty vehicle. Now, this chart in India scenario is a little different. So transport in India roughly is about 15% of all greenhouse gas emission. So it is lower in terms of the overall contribution. But what's really interesting is that in India, transport is the fastest growing sector when it comes to greenhouse gas emission. So today it may be 15%, but in next 4, 5, 10 years, the number is going to rise many folds if we don't do anything about it. Now, within this transport, road transport in India accounts for almost 90% of emission, and that's significantly high. And then if we come to the heavy-duty vehicles, that will be roughly about 60-65% if we include trucks and buses together. So cleaning road transport is even more important for India, and looking at the heavy-duty vehicle segment is also important. And the reason why we bring this point across is that if you look at this chart, you will realize that while the on-road vehicle stock is predominantly two-wheelers, followed by passenger cars, if we look at the emission, which is these bar charts, you will realize that if we add the heavy-duty trucks and medium-duty trucks and buses and a little bit of vans, we will be more than 50% of the emission. So while two-wheeler, three-wheelers may form almost 65% of the fleet, their contribution to emission is roughly about 17%. Whereas heavy-duty vehicles and trucks in general, if we add trucks and buses together, that would be 7-8% of our fleet, and then they are responsible for almost 55-60% of the total emission. So cleaning transport is important, but more than that, cleaning the medium and heavy-duty vehicles is equally important for us as a country. Now, one is this whole issue of climate, and then everyone really talks about it. But I think it's also important for energy security perspective, because if you look at in terms of the energy consumption, so road transport is roughly 90% of emission, but also the 90% of energy consumption when it comes to the petroleum products that we use. So it's also important, and we are seeing what is happening world over in terms of the ongoing crises that are happening, be it the war in Ukraine or some of the recent conversation in the Middle East. Now, this is also interesting because while climate change and some of these questions are slightly longer term impact, public health is something that is really, really important for a lot of people on a day-to-day basis. So if you look at this chart, you will realize that, and this is for Delhi, you will realize that transport accounts for almost a third of particulate matter emission that happens, PM 2.5 emission that happens in Delhi, and almost 80% of NOx emission. Similarly, we have very high for organic compounds as well as carbon monoxide emission. So it's important to clean transport because it's people's life that is at stake. So the question is, what is it that we do? And this chart is not for heavy-duty vehicles, it's for cars. But in a couple of weeks' time, we will come a similar analysis for heavy-duty vehicles as well for India. And the numbers would not be that dramatically different. So what we did a couple of years back, we wanted to look at various powertrain technologies that are available and figure out what technologies can deliver on climate targets. So basically looking at the life cycle emission in terms of greenhouse gas emission. So this is the 2021 number, and we have gasoline, we have diesel, we have compressed natural gas, we have hybrids, we have battery electric, and then we also have fuel cell EV. And we found that irrespective of what technologies you take, there are only two technologies that can clean the transport from the climate perspective, and which is incidentally also important from public health perspective, because these two technologies are zero tailpipe emission technologies, which is nothing but electrification of transport. So we looked at this, we looked at in terms of emission required in production, emission that are there in consumption, be it fuel or electricity. We also looked at emission involved in maintenance, battery manufacture, vehicle manufacture, so on and so forth. So it's complete life cycle analysis. And then when we said, if the vehicles that are sold in a scenario where the grid improves, and this is for a 2030 scenario, we realize that these numbers will be even cleaner. So we realize that now we know a pathway to clean transport, and the pathway is produce green electrons through renewable energy. Either you can store them in a battery and run the vehicle, as the battery electric vehicle, or you can use that energy to create green molecules, which is nothing but green hydrogen. And then that green hydrogen through fuel cell can be converted back to green electrons, and that can power the mobility. Now, one question that was asked, that what happens for India when the predominant mode of transport, a predominant electricity is coming through fossil fuel-based sources. So in that scenario also, we realize that the emission from these vehicles are less compared to other vehicles, largely because the electric vehicles are very efficient in terms of a technology, and the loss of in case of internal combustion engine is much higher as compared to electric. So even with the predominant the grid being predominantly coal-based as of now, electric vehicles were cleaner in terms of our analysis. Now, as we move further, the numbers will only increase. The question is, what does it, how does it impact the heavy-duty vehicle sales? So this is something that we have come recently as our publication. And then we realized that if India has to achieve a sub 2-degree scenario, or even to achieve a pathway for net zero target for 2070, we have to convert all our vehicles, including heavy-duty vehicles, to electric by not later than 2050. So between 2045 and 2050, we have to have all the fleet in India powered by electric. A large proportion of it will come through battery electric, and there will be some use cases for hydrogen fuel cell vehicle as well. So that is something that we have done as analysis, and just last week we came up with the report. Now the question is, what is happening to the heavy-duty vehicles around the world when it comes to electrification? We have realized that the sale of heavy-duty vehicles, electric heavy-duty vehicles, is increasing. Roughly more than 2% of the global sales of heavy-duty vehicle is now electric, and these numbers are going up steadily. And it's no surprise that China is leading this, but we are seeing that a lot of action actually happening in Europe as well as the US when it comes to heavy-duty vehicles. We are realizing that a lot of countries around the world are coming up with some kind of target, and this target is to shift entire trucking to 100% zero emission trucking. So UK and Europe are between 2035 and 2040. Similarly, California is around 2035. Similarly, Latin American countries are also looking at 2035, 2040. And then some of the other countries are also coming up with some kind of target. So there is a growing movement across the world to develop some kind of target on zero emission trucking. And it's an important development because it gives a signal to the industry that going forward, we are going to change the technology, we are going to change the fuel, and the industry be ready to embrace this transition. Now, there are five important challenges to this in India. And that is something we'll have to figure out as a nation. How do we address some of these challenges? So the first is the whole policy ecosystem is nascent. And when we look at the policy ecosystem, we realize that there are 5 important policy levers that are being used across the world to rapidly increase electrification. One is giving some kind of targets on sales in terms of phasing out the internal combustion engine. Second important policy instrument which is being used actively is some kind of supply requirement. So California has a very interesting program where they mandate OEMs to sell a certain proportion of the fleet as electric. Third is incentives, and that is something that we are doing pretty well, whether it is FAME incentives or state EV policies. They give financial incentives to bring down the cost so that people can buy. Infrastructure development is happening. We are seeing a lot of charging infrastructure being developed, but most of it is still for passenger cars and two-wheelers, nothing for heavy-duty vehicles. So that has to come. And the fifth important policy is some kind of demand requirement. And again, we are doing some of this work in India as well. Second important challenge in India is availability of models and makes. Now, if we see some of these announcements, we realize that only IPLT probably has a few trucks under operations. Tata, Ashok, Eicher, a lot of these companies have trucks in a prototype stage. So hopefully we might see these trucks coming soon. But as of now, we are not seeing too much action in terms of the development of these trucks in India. And one of the reasons is the high upfront cost and lack of financing option. Almost 75% vehicles that are sold in India are sold through financing. Outright purchase is just a quarter of the all vehicle sale. And if you look at the heavy-duty vehicle segment, this number is even more higher. So high upfront cost and the lack of financing is a major issue. And one of the reasons why it is a major issue in India specifically is that Indian fleet, if we look at and compare it to global counterparts, we'll realize that Indian trucks are actually smaller, they are lighter, and therefore they are much cheaper than global counterparts. A lot of it is, it also impacts the operation because the speeds are low. And then there is a lot of vehicle abuse that happens in terms of overloading and all. So because if you look at these vehicles in India, and because they are smaller and lighter, the cost is less. And therefore, we have to kind of, when we are coming up with battery electric trucks in India, the cost can vary anywhere between 4 to 5 times as compared to the diesel counterpart. So this is a major barrier, and we'll have to figure a way out on how do we bring down the cost of these trucks in India. Now, this is some kind of analysis that we did in terms of TCO, the total cost of ownership of battery electric truck, and you will see that the TCO for a battery electric truck is almost twice than the ICE trucks. And this can be reduced if we bring in some kind of subsidies for these trucks. So what you see on the x-axis is various policy interventions ranging from road tax waiver to interest subvention, subsidies in the tune of 10,000 rupees per kilowatt hour, which we are giving it for buses, will bring down the TCO. But if we add that subsidy from 10 to 15,000, then probably these trucks will break even in terms of the total cost of ownership. So how do we bring down the cost? How do we reduce the expenses? The high upfront cost is going to be a major issue in India. Now, we have to understand that because of the high upfront cost, battery electric trucks are compared to, let's say, the hydrogen fuel cell is cheaper. So as I said, we have two technologies, either hydrogen fuel cell or battery electric. But battery electrics are cheaper than hydrogen because the cost of green hydrogen is comparatively high than the battery electric vehicles. And what we are seeing globally is that the cost of batteries are coming down, and therefore, going forward, we might see that these numbers work even more in favor of the battery electric trucks. So basically what we said was, if we have to kind of move forward with the battery electric trucks in India, we have to, one, look at how do we address the policy ecosystem, because right now, if you know that the FAME policy, which is a central government policy on electrification, provides incentive to two-wheelers, fleets, buses, but it does not include anything on trucks. So that's a big issue. Similarly, the state EV policies also provide some kind of financial incentives, but none of those state EV policies provide any incentive to trucks in India. So how do we bring in these programs, be at national level or subnational level, to also include trucks is going to be vital, because that will kickstart the initial demand. And when we have these initial demand, we might see some models and makes available in the market. So we might see leading OEMs who are at the prototype stage might fast forward their development and bring these vehicles in the market. And once these vehicles come in the market, we might see competition resulting in reduction in the high upfront cost. And we are seeing very clearly, especially in the four-wheeler and two-wheeler space, the costs are coming down. And you've been following some of the stories from the West. All the large OEMs, including Tesla, have massively cut down their price. So much so that the Tesla's largest selling Model Y is now available in less than $30,000 per vehicle. So the high upfront cost will also come down, and with that, the financing options which are lacking will also go away. And we are seeing right now in terms of financing that financing for electric cars is very competitive, in some cases even better than internal combustion engine. But for the vehicle segment that is not there, there's still apprehension for the financial institutes to develop a financing model. It's also important that unlike passenger vehicle, financing might be different for trucks in India, because truck operation is very different. So people who have 5 or less truck form almost 75% of the market. It's a very disorganized market, mostly single owners. The competition is fierce. The margins are paper thin. And so with that as a background, how do we develop a robust financing mechanism so that the uptake of battery electrics can happen is definitely a challenge that we have to address. And then last but not least is this whole issue of refueling infrastructure, because unlike passenger vehicles, be it four-wheelers or two-wheelers, which you can charge at home, electric trucks cannot be charged at home. These are heavy-duty vehicles with larger battery packs. So they will necessarily have to have a public charging infrastructure. Public charging infrastructure at places where these trucks are parked, and so that they can be charged. And then looking at also kind of how do we accelerate some of the deployment of this public charging infrastructure is going to be vital for the uptake of these vehicles. Now, what we are seeing over here is that the distribution of the grid will also be important, because these trucks are going to require quite a substantive amount of energy. And while the infrastructure to support it, especially on highways, will be in the rural areas. So what kind of energy, what kind of substations, what kind of power lines we need to draw to support the charging of these heavy-duty vehicles is going to be very, very important. While we may have some of these infrastructure available in cities, but these trucks will operate intercity, and therefore a lot of the charging infrastructure will come up in rural areas. So right now, we are looking at maybe some of the initial pilot corridors as the potential places for infrastructure creation. So these are 25 such corridors which have high demand for passenger vehicles, which is undergoing electrification. We'll also have to figure out how much of this would be the initial corridors that will take up the electrification of heavy duty vehicles as well. So that's something that we'll have to keep up. And then basically, how do we bring in policies as well as investment so that the entire value chain can be fast-tracked, right from transmission line to distribution substation to distribution circuit to point of common interconnection to the meter, transformer, pole, charger, and eventually the truck. So what cost is to be borne by which operator? What will utilities, be it distribution companies, bear? What kind of cost will the charge point operators bear? And then the individual or the fleet of owners they will bear is something that we'll have to figure out. We also have to understand that not all the distribution companies have their own challenge because a lot of them are not doing financially well. So how do we bring that up? How do we bring these institutes up to the game is something that have to be looked at. So this is where I'll end, but just to conclude that right now, as we speak, the Ministry of Heavy Industries has created a task force to look at electrification of trucks in all seriousness, which we are leading. And hopefully in coming few weeks and months, you will see some kind of roadmap coming out on the pathway for truck electrification in India. So with this, I will end my presentation and